being in the middle of nowhere can be downright terrifying. You don't know who could be out there or what they want to do to you. It's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. When I was around 13, I went camping with my Girl Scout troop. This wasn't uncommon for us, as we camped often, at least twice a year. The only difference was that my troop had the privilege to camp at 2 nights and in a cabin. The cabins were not big. It was 5 foot, and if we were to lay down, width-wise, we only had about 3 feet of walking space between the bunks. Each side had 2 sets of bunk beds, so there were 8 beds in each cabin, and there were only 4 cabins. We had a large troop, so we occupied 3 cabins, including the mums who stayed the night with us. During the day, activities went on as normal. Other troops came to spend the day as we did arts and crafts, archery and other sport-like events. This ended around 7 when all the other girls went home. Around this time, we cooked dinner, ate, talked and then started a fire. We sat around and had girl talk like normal, ate dough balls and marshmallows until 9, and then we had to be back in bed due to the camp curfew. In my cabin, I had my 2 best friends, one in the bed below me, and the other in the bunk bed across from me. We had bunks that were close to the window, and my mum was sleeping in the cabin across the way, with my troop leaders and the other mums. Soon we were all asleep, except my friend Lisa, who was below me and wasn't very good at sleeping outside. She was awake, and soon sitting on the edge of my bunk, poking me. I cracked my eyes open and shone my flashlight at Lisa, then at Tara, who was across the way, and she woke up as well. Since we weren't technically allowed to be awake unless we were going to use the bathroom, we decided to go get my mum, who would take us through the trail to go to the bathroom, just to let Lisa catch a breather. By now, the fire was basically out, and we had my flashlight as our light source. So we bundled up, because New England is freezing at night even if it's spring. As we were getting dressed, I put my flashlight in my mouth so that I could use both my hands, but out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow. I thought it was my own and that camping was playing tricks on me, but I looked anyway. My scream may have broken all the rules the camp had about curfew. My entire cabin was up. My friends were screaming, and my mum and my leader were trampling over each other to get to the cabin. When I turned to look at the shadow, I saw it was actually a man staring through the window. I don't know how long he was there for, and when I started screaming, he took off. My troop leader talked to the ranger the next day, and he said he would talk to the night ranger about it, but we never got an answer. Either way, I never went camping there again.
This story is one that has been passed down to me from my late grandfather. The circumstances are so unusual, so unlike anything I have ever heard, that it's been in the back of my mind for nearly 20 years, ever since it was first told to me when I was a child. My grandfather was a great talker and storyteller in his own way, and my family agrees that he wouldn't mind if I shared it with others. The look on my grandfather's face every time he told this story, well, you could tell that it shook him up. First, I'll need to give you a little background. My grandfather was born in the early 20s in a dirt-floor 2-room farmhouse in rural South Carolina, an only child of sharecroppers during the Great Depression. He was a premature baby, and his parents, already having lost one infant, were understandably protective of him. I'm sure they were relieved and very happy that he was a strong and healthy child, albeit with an incredible amount of wanderlust. Restless and energetic, he almost always finished his chores as quickly as he could, so that he could take up his little fishing rod and roam to his heart's content. Back then, even horse-drawn carts were a rarity on those long-gone dirt roads. Cars were practically unheard of in that part of the country in those days. Disliking horses, but still greatly desiring to put as much distance between home and himself as he could in the span of an afternoon, my grandfather had little choice other than to walk. And walk he did. He combed through many miles of woods, fields and swampland, barefoot as the day he came into this world, heedless of brambles or snakes. They wouldn't bother him if he didn't bother them. As much as he enjoyed it, it was a lonely business. His father, with acres of land to tend to as well as livestock, hardly had the time to join his son on these walks. Sometimes one of the local boys would go with him, but that wasn't often. So, being practically kin to everyone within a 30-mile radius, my grandfather took up the grand old southern tradition of going visiting. One of his favourite places to go was to Uncle Peter's. Uncle Peter lived on one of those branches of the lake that stretched across a good portion of the county. It was a tiny shack, hardly more than a shanty, and barely big enough to fit both him and his spinster sister Henrietta, but they made do. Now, Uncle Peter loved to talk about as much as he loved to fish, so when he would spot my grandfather coming up the dirt track towards the house, he'd put whatever he was working on aside. Aunt Henrietta was prone to give him the stink eye for this, but she was fond of my grandfather too, so she never said anything. It became a tradition of sorts for my grandfather to put a spare shirt in a sack, along with a treat of some kind that his mother made, and head off for Uncle Peter's every other weekend. He did this for years, right up until he married my grandmother. Usually, it was about dark when he'd set off, meaning it was well after sunset before he got there, the distance between his house and Uncle Peter's being in the reckoning of about 6 or 7 miles. Grandfather tended to stay through Sunday, heading home after evening supper, which tended to be on the table well after dark. Suffice to say, there wasn't much to be afraid of back then other than the local wildlife, and as I said before, as long as you minded your own business, they minded theirs. He'd been walking through the countryside at night all his life. He was comfortable and felt very safe. As had become habit throughout the years, Grandfather kissed Aunt Henrietta goodbye, shook Uncle Peter's hand, and started home at a brisk pace. It was autumn, so the air was pleasantly cool, a welcome relief from summer's oppressively humid heat. He said that there was a full moon that night, and when he could walk out in the open, it was fairly well lit. He could easily see where he was going. The dirt track that led away from Uncle Peter's shack meandered through a bit of marshland before it ended at the wider road. Usually he didn't take that route unless he felt like a bit of a wander, since cutting through the fields and woodland was a straighter shot back to his parents' farmhouse, and the road slithered and slunk its way around the far side of the lake before curving back in the direction of home. That night, however, with the moonlight and the refreshing nip in the wind, Grandfather felt the urge to do a bit of meandering. Turning at the end of the path, he stepped onto the road, barefoot as a jaybird and softly whistling to himself. The route was so familiar that he hardly paid any attention to the surroundings, letting his feet do most of the work while he occupied himself with other thoughts. Before he knew it, he was approaching the lake. The water was calm that night, dark and still. He slowed down a little, wanting to watch the way the light rippled and shimmered gently. It was such a pretty sight that he nearly missed what was standing not far up the road. At first, it was just a silhouette, a tall and solid-looking shadow that seemed to be facing the water. Grandfather thought it might have been a trick of the light initially. After all, he had walked through a cemetery once in the middle of the night and thought he'd seen a soldier riding a white horse until he'd gotten closer and realized it was just a large dewdrop spiderweb. Yet, as he drew nearer, he realized it wasn't his eyes. There was something standing on the side of the road. In fact, it was a man. He could tell by the build. broad-shouldered and narrow at the hip. And he could tell by the clothes. Even in the moonlight, it was evident that the man wore a dark suit that did not fit him well. A shapeless hat was on his head, causing his form to appear elongated and odd-looking. From the distance of several feet, Grandfather could see the shine of good shoes, polished until they picked up the water's gleam. The man was standing close to the water, so close in fact that the waves were lapping at those expensive-looking shoes. The lake's shifting reflection softly illuminated his face, and Grandfather could make out strong features that had been weathered with time and toil. The lines around his mouth and eyes were distinctive as he smiled. That was when Grandfather realized that the man was smiling at him. In fact, the man had been staring at him just as long, or longer, as Grandfather had been doing the same. Quickly remembering his manners, he greeted the man politely. The man's expression didn't change, as his head turned to follow my grandfather's movement until he stopped on the other side of the road. A little unnerved, my grandfather stood awkwardly for a long moment, waiting for what he thought would be the appropriate amount of time for a reply. The man didn't speak. His face never changed, but he slowly brought his hand up and made a beckoning motion with his fingers, silently asking my grandfather to come closer. Grandfather shook his head. "No, sir, I can't stay and talk. I have to get home. You have a nice night." Dipping his head, my grandfather started walking again, passing the strange man with a slightly quicker pace than he'd been walking before. Feeling that he was being watched, he stopped again a little further up the road. He turned to look back to see the man had turned around so that he was facing the direction of my grandfather, still staring at him, but now he was waist deep in the water. Confused and shocked, Grandfather could only gape at the man as he stood in the lake, that same grin on his face as he lifted his hand and beckoned again. Shaking his head quickly, my grandfather repeated what he'd said before, the words out of his mouth before he could think about how weird they sounded now. "No, sir, I can't stay and talk. I have to get home. You have a nice night." He whipped around and started walking even faster up the road, listening for the sound of splashing or footsteps behind him. But there was nothing. And that was when it struck him. He had never heard a sound. No splash, no drip, no scuffle of shoes against dirt. Silence. Closing in on the trees, he felt a shiver run down his back as the feeling of being watched washed over him again. He froze on the spot. Everything in him was telling him to just keep walking and not to stop until he was through his mother's kitchen door. But there was an even stronger urge to turn around, to look back one more time. The compulsion was too much to resist. He turned again to look at the lake. The man was still there, only now he was further in. The water was up to his shoulders now, and he was still smiling. Even from the distance of several yards in the dark, Grandfather somehow knew the man was still smiling. There was movement, and he saw the man lift his hand a third time, motioning for him to come back, to come closer, to come into the water. Grandfather wasn't sure of which, or even if it was any of those things, and he never found out. Without a word, he turned to face the trees and walked away. He walked the several miles home, unnerved and perplexed. And for the next 80 years, until his death at the age of 91, he never figured out who the man was, why he was there, or what he wanted. Over and over again he told us that story. The encounter clearly haunted him. It haunts me. I shudder to think what would have happened had my grandfather actually gotten close to that man, or lingered by the lake that night. But the one thing that has stuck out in my mind about his experience, more than anything, is that the man stood almost neck deep in water, and didn't even make a ripple.
I was in Japan visiting a small town called Ohito. Back in 2010, I went to an onsen, which is sort of like a spa with natural hot springs, that abutted a small mountain. After spending some time relaxing at the onsen, I decided to hike the small mountain behind it. As I approached, I noticed a strange structure at the foot. It was a large tiered rock that had some small openings on each level, going into the side of the mountain. The rock was cracked, missing or falling apart, with much vegetation and overgrowth. Whatever the structure was, it had not been used for some time. The scale of it was such that it would have been too large for me to climb. So I went to one of the sides, and there I found a footpath up the mountain. It wasn't a very long hike, perhaps 30 minutes. I think I started the hike in the afternoon, maybe somewhere around 3 p.m. And it was a beautiful sunny day. I didn't see or hear anything along the hike. When I reached the top, I found a lookout point that overlooked the onsen and the town. It was a pristinely beautiful view. The trail continued on from the lookout, so I followed a little further upwards and eventually came to an entryway to a very small temple. There were some statues and things that you typically find at temples. The entryway had a gate, which is like what you see in movies or whatever. The two pillars holding up a bowed piece at the top. As I walked through the gateway, the air became very still, and everything went silent. There was absolutely no ambient noise, and I continued towards the temple, observing the statues and things along the way. I didn't go inside, because I heard that nobody is really supposed to go in, so out of respect, I stayed out. So I just walked around the perimeter. When I came around to the back, I started to hear some kind of low-pitched chanting. My hair stood on end, and it freaked me the hell out at first. I just stood there for a moment until I calmed down. It sounded like it was coming from the other side of the shrine. But I was just there, and it was so quiet I'm sure that there was nobody else around. I was still a bit on edge, so I peered around the corner, and what I saw was 8 Japanese men dressed in traditional garments and robes, but their faces looked old, incredibly wrinkled, so wrinkled that I could barely make out features like eyes, nose or a mouth. Some of them were carrying something that looked like rocks, but they would flicker and shimmer gold when the sun hit them. They were walking down the path from the gateway towards the temple, chanting. It was so strange. I didn't approach them because I feared that they would be upset or angry that a foreigner was trespassing on their holy ground. So I stayed behind the temple until I didn't hear the chanting anymore. Once the chanting stopped, I peered back around the corner. Probably no more than 2 minutes had gone by since the chanting had finished. It felt like an eternity. I didn't see them, but I thought they might just be silently huddled around the very front of the temple, out of my current line of sight. So I crept off into the woods and slowly made my way around the perimeter until the front of the temple was in my line of sight. This probably took no more than a minute. There was nobody there. I was pretty well creeped out at this point, so I hastily made my way back down the mountain. The temple wasn't very big, and I doubt all of them could have fit in there, and the path ended there, so I have absolutely no clue who they were or where they could have gone. I didn't tell anyone in my group what I saw, because I didn't know anyone very well, and just thought that they wouldn't believe me, or simply wouldn't care.
I'm a pretty avid backpacker in the Pacific Northwest. Sometimes I'll hike for days on end without seeing another person. I think it's exhilarating being completely alone. There's really no feeling like it. But personally, I can never help but be on edge. The environment is completely serene and friendly, but there's a constant feeling in the back of your mind. It's hard to put your finger on. Most of the time, you'll be chugging along, comfortable in your mind, but when you stop for rest, or to fill up your water, you can't help but to look over your shoulder. Nothing bothers me much out in the woods. I've ran into brown bears, had elk trample through campsites late at night, and much more. But one night was different. I was on a deep backwoods hike in the late fall, off-season. Was pretty cold, but the snow hadn't quite started falling yet. I like that, in fact. I usually plan my trips this way. The forest ranger that I talked to when I was organising the trip said I was the only hiker she knew of who'd be up there at that time. I was using dispersed camping sites so far off the beaten path, they don't have fire pits. That night was 5 or 6 miles from the trail into the area. I set up camp at a site about 100 yards from a stream, close enough that a faint babbling was audible. I'd lit a fire, cooked dinner, read for a while, and was settling down to sleep. I lay, listening for a while to the sounds of the woods and the creek. Just as I was nodding off, I think I hear voices. Nothing distinct, no clear words, but clearly a group of people was having a good time, laughing, maybe telling stories around a campfire. A feeling of dread came over me. I thought I shouldn't leave the tent. Fear, like I've never felt, engulfed me. All the hairs on my arms, legs, and on the back of my neck stood on end. I lay there for a while in panic. The voices carry on laughing indistinctly. After a while, they receded into the background noise. I still didn't leave the tent. I was too afraid. The next morning, after a very short night's sleep, I searched the surrounding area and the path to the site. The few shoe prints I found were faded and worn around the edges, too old and too few to be from the size of the group I'd heard. I tried to shrug it off as nerves. Maybe nervousness got the best of me, but I couldn't shake a certain tension. I made good time to my next site, the last of the trip, looking around a little more than usual. Still, nobody to be seen. That site had no stream. Dry camping isn't a blast, but it's doable if you pack enough water for cooking and drinking for the night. It was a lot quieter, just the chirps of bugs and the wind rustling the trees. I cooked my dinner and stayed up a good while after dark, sitting on a log, looking at the stars and listening to the sounds of the forest, trying to hear the voices from the night before, but there was nothing. I turned in for the night, stretching every act out. I lay there, restless for what felt like hours. Finally, calm comes over me. And then, it's back. Nothing threatening or particularly scary, just the sounds of a group of about 15 to 20 having a good time, barely audible above the background noise. This time I'm calm, and there's what seems like an internal dialogue in the back of my mind. Why not join them? Sounds like they're having fun. I'd really rather stay here. This is entirely unconscious, and goes on for a while. I'd never experienced anything like this. I was worried that I'd lost it. After a time, the noises faded away into the white noise, and I felt that I was alone. The next day, I packed up as quickly as I could and got out of Dodge. During the day, I was more at ease, like I'd always been in the past. I was relieved when I got to the car and started back home. I told the story a few times, and every time I felt a little bit of that dread from the first night. I really had no reason to feel strongly about what had happened. I just heard strange noises in the forest, nothing extraordinary, but I felt it. On one occasion, I told the story to my teacher, who was a native. He got quiet for a minute, then said I'd run into stick Indians. He said that it was good that I didn't leave the tent. Stick Indians are evil and dangerous beings that prey on women and children. The look on his face was sober. He told me not to go back to that place again. These spirits are extremely aggressive and attack and kill at the slightest provocation, including even saying their Salish name, which he refused to do. Whenever the subject comes up, I get that same fear in me. As I write this, I'm thousands of miles from those sites, and my arms are still quaking.
I was camping on land associated with the Anasazi, long dead Pueblo Indians that very few people know anything about. This was when I was a Boy Scout. We hiked for a few days and we saw black bears every day. It's normally a somewhat unusual sight and freaked out the adult leaders and caused us to religiously use anti-bear tactics like bear bags. Not totally related to the story, but it slowed us down, which led us to the events here. Anyway, we camped in a wood cabin at the bottom of a plateau, and the local rangers told us a bunch of spooky camp stories about the plateau and its relation to the long-dead Anasazi people. Even their real names is lost to history, as Anasazi is what the Navajo called them, meaning ancient enemies, or those who are not us. Another part of what they told us that stands out is that the Anasazi were obsessed with ravens, and possibly crows as well, and a lot of their superstition revolved around massive raven people, and people with raven heads, stuff like that. I completely forget all the other details at this point, as it was well over a decade ago. Anyway, my tent mate is a bit slow, and is also very allergic to peanuts. He ends up eating some of the pre-packaged food that contains a copious amount. That, combined with the ongoing poor planning, fear of bears and sloppy leadership, causes the adults to decide to camp out on the plateau rather than keep going. On this scout ranch, you're only supposed to camp outside the designated areas and never on the particular plateau, just because of the geography and the environment. But forget the rules, because we do anyway. We set up camp, eat, lay the bear bag, and head off to sleep. That night, though, was the craziest thing. I could hear so much thunder, and so could my tent mate, but absolutely no rain, like insanely loud. My tent mate and I were terrified. It could have been heat lining, but it sounded impossibly close. We're terrified. He, the braver one of the two, actually goes out to check. As he opens the flap, I see the forest behind him. He comes back a few minutes later, and the thunder pretty much stops at the same time. He looks at me and goes to bed without saying anything at all. It's not unusual in itself. He could be pretty slow and non-social, and likely had mild autism in hindsight. But the next day, we wake up and a ton of things popped red flags. Firstly, our tent is facing an open field, which is very strange, because yesterday we both saw Forrest from when he left the tent to check. Second, no one else heard lightning that night, except for us, which was absolutely crazy as it was loud enough to wake everyone on Earth. Remember how my tent mate checked out the thunder as well? Well, he had no recollection of what he saw. He woke up confused, saying that the last thing that he remembered was just stepping outside. The good part, though, The guy in the tent next door brought this up before we did. He also decided to get up and check it out, and he claims that when he stepped out of the tent, there were no trees anywhere. Just extremely long, tall pole objects, almost as if there were thousands of stilts. When he looked up, he also said that there was no lightning visible, but it was super bright, full moon on steroids bright. He also claimed that he had seen flying, winged, pitch black objects, bigger than cars, and they looked like they had wings on them and that they were round. He dove back inside and doesn't remember going to sleep or the noise going away. Remember the giant raven myths? I did, and I was scared shitless. I wouldn't have believed him if I hadn't have seen the trees and heard the thunder for myself. When I was 14, I lived in a very rural area. As teens often do, I got very bored in my small town, and to alleviate my boredom, my friends and I would routinely explore the surrounding areas and go on long day hikes. There are 2 instances I can remember of being very creeped out on one of our expeditions. The first time was in the summer. My 2 friends and I decided to hike across several dozens of kilometers. We of course prepared adequately, as any group of 14-year-olds would. We had water and a bag of jerky between the 3 of us. Naturally, we got very hungry, as the jerky ran out quickly. To combat this, we decided to cut through the back roads and the farmlands, so that we could get to the highway faster and thus lead to food. After about an hour of hungry hiking, we came upon a little village that was all gated up and surrounded by brambles. This itself isn't too creepy. What was creepy was the fact that just inside the gate was a mountain of cattle corpses. There seriously would have at least been 3 dozen bodies in the pile. As kids, we were sufficiently spooked. As an adult, I think a logical reason for Death Mountain may have been that the herd were diseased, and this was an easy way to quarantine. The second time was with the same friends, but we were a few years older. On our adventure, we decided to walk through railroad tracks to gather old rail spikes so that we could sell them to the scrapper. After a few grueling hours of hiking and carrying increasingly heavier backpacks, we happened upon a house. It was very secluded, but from outside it didn't look abandoned. Curiosity and fatigue got the better of us. We dropped our bags and went in exploring. We initially just wanted some water, but we found the front door wide open. Outside, there was a lot of construction machinery, so we thought that perhaps they were doing/finishing some work inside. We called out but received no reply, so with recklessness, we decided to effectively break and enter. This place turned out to be a dump. It looked like a crack house. Old garbage and food everywhere. We assumed no one lived there after all. So what do? We decide to snoop around. And we were poking around the ground floor when we heard what sounded like footsteps on the second floor. We called out but no answer was given. My one friend decides to be brave and go up to check it out. As he got to the stairs, he calls out again. Nothing. So he starts up the stairs, and I shit you not, as his foot hit the first step, we heard a music box go off. Alright, kind of creepy. But then we heard a child's giggle from above us. We noped out of there pretty quickly and ran home. We even forgot our backpacks. A few years ago, I moved to Fort Worth and later took a job in Lubbock, Texas. I had a wedding to attend back in Missouri, so I took a load of my stuff to my new apartment in Lubbock and then drove back to Missouri. It was a long drive, and I left the wedding reception around 6 or 7 and headed back to Lubbock because I started my new job in the morning. Between Lubbock and Wichita Falls, there is a 3.5-hour stretch of highway that is mostly ranch country. There are a few really tiny towns sprinkled in, but you can drive the whole 3.5 hours and never see a car if you do it at the right time. I happened to go through around 3 a.m. So I turn onto the highway, which runs basically straight, east-west, looking forward to the last leg of the drive, and finally, the prospect of being able to sleep. There was no one on the road. There's no reception for me once I left Wichita Falls, and until I got back to Lubbock. So, here I am driving through ranch country with no reception and nothing around, and I come to one of the first little tiny towns. On the side of the road, in the middle of a town, is a car that seems to be broken down. There is a woman standing there with the hood up and a jack nearby, but not actually being used, and she's trying to wave me down. Normally I stop and help in situations like this, but I really needed to get back and get some proper sleep for my first day. And something about it just felt wrong. As soon as I passed the car, the woman runs to the passenger side and gets in. A man springs out from hiding beside the other side of the car, slams down the hood, jumps in and starts the car. They start driving after me. It was all super hurried as soon as I didn't stop. So I did what anyone would do and pumped it up to 80-90 and hoped that there wasn't a loose cow. I could see their headlights on the highway behind me for a long time, but they eventually seemed to have given up. We hadn't come to any other town or place to turn off, so they must have turned around. I was super creeped out, but kind of forgot about it until the other day. I got in at 6 a.m. and had to be at work by 8 a.m. So the event in my mind got a little bit lost in between my power nap and first day. I am a biologist, and one of the perks of the job is being able to see some remote and spectacular places that people don't often see. Part of my work involves collecting insects from remote watering holes out in the middle of Australia, a few 100 kilometers north of Uluru. One of the ladies I work with, Alice, lives out there full time and spends a lot of her time in the bush, as well as with the local Aboriginal people. She has a trove of stories and weird experiences, but I just thought I'd tell you about the one that I had. So, as I said, I visit a lot of waterholes out there. Being a very arid region, these waterholes hold great spiritual and cultural significance to the indigenous people. Most, if not all of them, are scared in some way, and they have all traditional stories attached to them. So one day, 4 of us are heading out to this particular site. A full day of heavy 4-wheel driving through the Finke Gorge. When we get there not long before sundown, as we pull up there is a black dingo standing in the spot that we are going to camp. He stares at us for a bit, then disappears off into the bush. This is normal, they always do that, and isn't weird in itself. There are plenty of dingoes out there and they come in a wide range of colours. It's not that common to see a black one around there, but it's fine. We set up camp and have a nice night looking for pythons and drinking wine. We slept in swags, kind of like tents that just fit in a sleeping bag, and sometimes has a little fold-up netting so that you can sit up in there. It was really windy that night, so no problems with spooky noises, and I went to sleep pretty quickly. That night, though, is when I had it. The extremely vivid dream about the black dingo coming into camp. It was sniffing around my swag and scratching at the netting as if it were trying to get in. The dream bothered me, and I woke up and went back to sleep pretty soon after. Still, not so weird. We woke up in the morning, did our sampling, packed up camp and started off back on the long drive to town. After we'd been driving for a bit, Alice starts talking about how seeing the black dingo at the campsite yesterday really freaked her out. She didn't say anything earlier because she didn't want to spook us, but it turns out that in the traditional folklore, the waterhole is protected by a black dingo spirit. The last time Alice camped out there with other people, one of them had a dream that a black dingo came up to their swag, managed to get in, and began attacking her. This lady woke up in a panic, with long, deep scratches all over her face, and no reasonable explanation for how they got there. I had no idea about this story before I had my dream, and I didn't even mention it to anyone that morning. There is definitely a special feeling to a lot of these places. It's very hard to describe, but when you're out in the country, these kinds of weird semi-spiritual coincidences are commonplace. I'm just very glad that nothing bad came from mine. I used to regularly walk portions of the Appalachian Trail, and usually take a week or two by myself. Anyway, at one point I was coming over a pass and saw a figure on the trail ahead. Seems to be a lone young woman. It's twilight and the moon will be bright. I have solar rechargeable lamps, and I yell ahead, "Ahoy!" She doesn't break stride or pause. Being on the trail, people are friendly and cooperative. Looks like she's had a bad day, and no tent. Now sure, I like to sleep under the stars, and I usually hike with a hammock and a rainfly, but something seemed off. We were way out here. The last trail shelter was a few miles back, and we were on a very heavy bush cliff. Nowhere you want to camp for the night. I figure she might be wary of strangers at night, so I keep my own pace and don't really pay much more attention to her, until she disappears over the next pass, and I realise she's walking this trail. Now dark, with some moonlight but heavy tree cover, without a torch, lamp or any personal light source, I'm getting worried about this girl. Remember, we are walking with a sheer cliff face a few yards away from us, and conditions aren't perfect. Roots, dirt, mud, moss, rocks, anything can trip you up. So I pick up pace and hurry over to the pass. She's nowhere, and there's a clear line of sight probably 200 yards ahead, and she's nowhere to be seen. But then I see a torch in the distance. Red lamp. Actually, there's two now that I'm getting closer. I flash my torch, and they flash theirs. I call ahoy, and a man and woman respond. We finally meet up and do the whole meet and greet, exchange trail names and chat for a bit about what's ahead in our paths, since we were walking opposite directions. I say to the girl, "You worried me back there. I saw you walking without a light and then you disappeared over the pass. I'm sorry I spooked you. Didn't think you were that far off though. Must have run like crazy to cover as much ground." She looked confused. "What are you talking about?" I explained everything, and she said that she hadn't seen anyone on the trail for at least 3 miles. There was no one reported missing, no abandoned campsites, nothing. I followed up with state police and rangers. Nothing. Who the hell was on the trail ahead of me? Walking at night with no light, minimal gear, and then to just suddenly disappear when there's only one way to go along the trail? I'm still clueless. A couple of years ago, my girlfriend and I were camping in the Pacific Northwest between San Francisco and Portland. We had rented a car and were stopping at different campsites every night on our way from the former to the latter. The first night we arrive at a campsite, we find that it had been closed for the season, despite the fact that we looked on their website and they say that they were open. So we ended up driving around, looking for another campsite on Google Maps. But at this point, it's getting dark. We see a forest firefighter outpost and pull in to ask them if they know of any nearby. They tell us that most of them are closed for the season, but there are a couple on their old map that we haven't checked. We get back on the road and find our way to one of these campsites. The sign for this place is literally resting on the ground and is a little overgrown. But at this point it's dark as hell, and we really don't have many other options. As we pull our car into what we think is a spot, we see a few other tents nearby, so we take it as a good sign. We get out and start to set up our things, when immediately, things begin to get strange. Two guys walk directly through our spot and strike up a conversation with us. Both are looking a little rough. One of them has a zip-up hoodie without a shirt underneath, and I notice that he is extremely skinny. They're also both really dirty and have messed up hair, but hey, we're camping. They're both speaking very fast and seem kind of nervous. They tell us that they're actually seasonal workers nearby and are staying at this campsite to save money whilst they're there. Whilst we're talking to these two guys, a decade-old white Mercedes pulls into the campsite with all four windows blasting rap music. The driver and passenger look like some real ICP enthusiasts. They look around quickly and leave immediately. At the time, I thought they were probably looking for a campsite too. The two rough dudes also leave, and we continue setting up camp. Not too long after, we get another visitor. This time it's an older woman, with a 3-pack-a-day voice. She's nice enough, but also asking us some pretty weird questions. "You guys here for the horror show?" she asks. I'm thinking, what's a horror show? "Do you mean the haunted house, lady?" She tells us that lots of people come out for the horror show, and starts warning us about all the ghouls and zombies. She eventually leaves, and my girlfriend and I agree they must be talking about some kind of haunted house nearby, as it was early October. And you know, maybe that's where the seasonal worker dudes who looked kind of scary happened to be working at. It all checked out in my mind. We start our fire, and I begin breaking out the wood, when my girlfriend admits that she's freaked out. She's worried about the people that we've encountered and how strange this campsite is. She points out that there aren't really any sounds coming from anyone else's tents, with the exception of the one woman, who wouldn't stop coughing. No music, no children, laughter, nothing. I'm starting to believe her. But at this point it's pretty late, and we don't really have any other options. I'm also thinking that if the campsite is weird, it's just some harmless weirdos. She seems pacified by my confidence, and we continue making dinner. It's at this point a bunch of really weird shit starts happening. The two dudes we met right when we got there emerge from the woods without any source of light and without saying a word, walking straight into their tent. They have a very short and heated discussion which I can't make out. One of them storms out of the tent and walks straight towards the older woman's campsite, making eye contact with me for an uncomfortably long amount of time. He then climbs into the cab of her pickup truck, and I realise there's already someone in there, and likely has been for some time. Probably the woman. You can tell that they start smoking something from when the lighter flickers. This strikes me as especially odd. You smoke cigarettes in the car? Probably not. Pot? We're at a campsite in Northern California, and I'm pretty sure there aren't any kids around. Why go into the car to do that? Then it hits me like a sack of bricks. It's meth. They were all smoking meth, and the woman was probably dealing. The level of comfort she had established in her campsite indicated that she'd been there for a while. Meth explained why everyone was looking like emancipated zombies. It explained the juggalos driving through, getting spooked, and leaving. It explained the strange erratic behaviour and constant coughing from everyone. This was clearly some sort of live-in meth village at a closed-down campsite in the backwoods of Northern California. It's at this moment that I realise the second guy is skulking around the edge of our campsite, clearly trying not to be seen. I conceded to my girlfriend that I also wanted to leave. We packed up everything very slowly and normally, trying to make it look like we were just putting away food and putting our fire out for the night. With only the tent left, I tell my girlfriend to get into the car and get ready to back out of the spot. The second I pick up the tent, the woman's truck starts up and her lights turn on. They were blindingly bright circular lights on a rack. I throw the tent into the trunk as fast as I can and I tell my girlfriend to back up. I'm standing behind the car to guide her, but also making it very clear to whoever's watching us that I have a hatchet. I was so on edge that if Mr. Rogers caught me off guard, I would have buried that thing into his skull. She throws the car into reverse, hits the pedal, and the car doesn't move. I can hear the engine revving, and I see the car lurching, but it's not going anywhere. For a split second I think they've slashed our tyres somehow. This is how horror movies start. Suddenly it hits me. The parking brake is likely on. It was. She backs up, gets on the main path, and I jump in the passenger seat. As we drive out there, we can hear them start screaming about something. Once we get onto the main road, we do a Chinese fire drill. And I drive down the road at warp speed to the first bed and breakfast that we see. It was lovely.
Last summer I road tripped across the U.S. solo for 2 months. I left Crater Lake in Prospect, Oregon, heading to California later than I'd planned. And I was looking to camp anywhere I could find. My gas light had been on for 30 miles, and there hadn't been any gas stations, so I was getting a little nervous. I finally saw a sign for a campground, and I figured I could talk to whoever was camping there to find out how far away a gas station was, and maybe sleep there for the night. It was an old logging site, so the road there was very rough and very far from the main road. I pulled in, and there was a mid to late 20s couple at the very first site. I said hello, and asked them if they knew the area. I got a sense of genuine friendliness from them. They said the nearest gas station was only 2 miles away, but that it was closed for the night. The site next to them was open, and they suggested that I take it. I started setting up my tent, and was using a rock to get my stakes in the ground, when the guy showed up with his hand axe and offered to help. Creepy, but helpful. I asked if he drank, and offered him a beer as a neighborly gesture. His wife/girlfriend came over and asked if I had any pills. Just some ibuprofen. But why don't you have some weed I picked up in Washington? They reminded me to pay for my site at the self-serve box. More than once. Red flag. So I said I didn't have any cash. They said I could just write my credit card information down and put it in the box. 1,000 red flags. The woman wanted to introduce me to the neighbors. So she took me to an RV that looked like it had been parked there for multiple months. Cardboard over the wheels, dirty. Inside, a very drunk man, somewhere over 60. A woman who insisted on feeding me the tacos she was cooking. And a dog looking at me like maybe I had food in my pockets. The drunk man started a very long story that wound up being a joke, with the punchline being Jeffrey Dahmer cannibalism based. And at the moment, the woman handed me a taco. I said I had to check on something, got the fuck out of the trailer, tossed the taco to the dog following me, and proceeded to crack open a beer to put together a plan. These people were messed up, but I didn't feel like I was in any immediate danger. I decided to shoot the breeze with the guy from the first couple, and the way he described it, they'd been camping for 2 weeks because money ran out. Pretty soon I heard the old woman yelling at the man, "That's it, I've had it." I had stated that I was thinking about heading over to the gas station to see if it was actually closed, just so I could get a few more miles in for the day. Old lady comes over to where Dude and I are standing and says, "He's really done it this time. Next ride into town that comes my way, I'm gonna take it." I sip my beer. Younger woman says to me, "I can ride with you to the gas station, just so you find it." I take a much larger sip of my beer. I'm starting to get really uncomfortable. I make up some shit excuse to go back to my site, rip up my tarp, tent, and fly all together, shove it in the back of my car, and got the fuck out of there. Made it to the gas station, which was indeed closed, but passed a charming B&B less than a mile before. I explained to the desk clerk that I had a very weird encounter at a campsite, and I would be sleeping in my car in their lot that night. She wanted to sell me a room I couldn't afford, but wound up offering the use of their bathroom and morning coffee. Filled up my tank in the morning, and bid farewell to Prospect, Oregon.
It was either late November or early December, and about 5 or 6 years ago. I was deeply religious at the time, and we were heading over to one of those living nativity things, where they have actors pretend to be the Virgin Mary, Joseph, and the wise men, etc. And they kind of put on an outdoor show. It was held at a Christian campground outside of a nearby city, and we didn't know the area very well, so we had some directions given to us. This was winter in the US, so it was already getting dark when we set out. We got to the area just fine, but had forgotten the name of the exit that we were supposed to take to actually reach the grounds. Luckily, the campgrounds had a big sign right next to an exit, so we assumed that this was the way to go. We took the road and thought nothing of it. Crisis averted. The city this campground is next to is actually quite large, and the exit we took is very close to a shopping district, so we weren't completely in the middle of nowhere, but still quite isolated. But very abrupt, this exit turned from civilization to deep woods. We thought, well, it's a campground, so that's about right, and we kept driving. Pretty soon we passed a clearing on the right. The clearing was perhaps 50 feet, and then the woods again. and at every edge of the woods, we could see this huge stone gate with wrought iron doors. It looked like a cemetery gate, but it didn't lead to a path or anything, it was just trees. Had no fence around it either, just a gate. We kept going, remarking to each other that it was kind of creepy, but still we didn't think much of it. It was starting to get foggy. At this point, it felt like maybe I should point out that despite being winter, it wasn't that cold and there was not any snow. And a while later, we came to some houses. This is where things got weird. The first house was a standard suburban house, but in the driveway, which was very short, was a van with the doors open. The hazard lights were on too. Like the car was on, but nobody was in or around it, and the house was completely dark. We were a little nervous now, wondering if perhaps something bad had happened, like an accident or something, and the driver of our car slowed down to look. Then my other friend, in the front, pointed ahead. As it turns out, all of the houses on the street were like this, on both sides of the road. Lights out, cars in the driveway, all the car doors open, with the hazard lights on. At this point we're more than a little freaked out, thinking we've driven straight into Silent Hill, or a particularly mean prank. Though it seems a little strange to do a community-wide prank in the middle of nowhere. We hadn't seen any people, mind you, and for whatever reason we continued to drive. Maybe to get out of there faster, and then there was a little bend in the road. The instant we started to go through it, this massive black dog came out of nowhere and ran full tilt at the driver's side of the car. I'm still not sure if the dog actually made contact with the car, but if not, it came incredibly close. After charging at us, it had no intention of retreating. It stayed in the road, barking its head off. Our driver did a quick U-turn, and we got out of there as fast as possible. Ditched the nativity thing, and never tried to go back. We found out when we got home and spoke to the person who gave us directions that it wasn't even the right exit we were on, and now, several years later, we're not exactly sure which exit we took that night. All I know is that I'm glad we chose to get out of there when we did. I don't want any part of whatever was going on that night. I was a forest fire lookout in the summers during college. I went weeks between seeing another human sometimes. Some of the first things I witnessed or heard whilst doing the job are just flat unexplained. The one that sticks out in my mind was laying in bed and watching a strange light move through the trees. Figured it was a car headlights, until it went vertically up into the air and just hung there for 30 minutes. Just sitting 20 or 30 miles away, parallel with my tower. It was an elevation of 7,000 feet. I watched it until it dipped back below the tree line and never saw it again. At the time I was super creeped out, but chalked it up to another one of the dozen things that I could have seen that I hadn't explained before and no one would believe. But the next day, another lookout called me on the radio, asking if I'd seen the same light. He was much closer but on the other side of it. He said from his perspective, after it dipped below the trees, it landed in an area he knew to be a lake that was only accessible by hiking or horseback. It stood out in my mind because it was the only strange light that summer that we couldn't explain away by either planes, balloons, or tricks of the light from cars. I have since wondered if it were a drone, but this was before they were really obtainable to hobbyists, and have never seen one with lights that could be seen from as bright as 20 miles away, or one that could hover in place for about 30 minutes around then. This is where things get weird. The lake where the lights settled down into, according to the other lookout, is a pretty popular spot for fishing trout. That summer, the lake developed some form of algae, or just something, and all the fish died off. They stocked it with fish, and they just kept on dying. No one remembers this happening before that summer that we saw the light land in it. It was like this for the next 2 or 3 months that I came back as a lookout. No fish could live in it. Just another weird story from my early 20s as a fire lookout. This happened to my grandparents. My grandparents were born in Mexico, late 20s and early 30s, and this story took place in the mid-40s. They had moved into a super small town in the mountains of Jalisco. I've been to it once when I was smaller. It was fairly beautiful, and everyone there was super nice, except for when you would mention who they called La Señora. Basically, the story as my grandmother told it is that she and my grandfather had been living there for about 2 or 3 months, and had began to get familiarized with how the town functioned. The town was fairly normal, except for the fact that at night, no one went outside. One night, they decided to go to a newly made friend's house on the other side of town. After staying late into the night, they decided it was best for them to walk back to their house. Their friend advised them that it would be the best thing to do if they stayed the night, because he didn't want them to be scared if they came across something. To which they asked what exactly it was that he was talking about. They explained that the town is haunted by a woman dressed in black Victorian-esque clothing that is usually spotted around the center plaza during the dead of night. The locals have no actual name for her other than La Señora, or whatever random name they called her in order to try and quell the fears and downplay her existence. Despite the friend's request to have them spend the night there, they decided to walk back, as it wouldn't take them any more than 10 minutes to reach their house. They weren't superstitious by any means, and just shrugged it off. They left the friend's house around 3 a.m. and began making their way back to their house, when they saw her, a woman dressed in all black, standing near a lamppost in the town plaza. My grandma remembers the air becoming fairly cold, and a sense of despair filling every inch of her as they got closer and closer to this thing. My grandpa proceeds to grab my grandma tight as they got within 8 feet of the woman. The roads in the town are extremely narrow, so you don't have much room to go around people. My grandma went on to tell me how the lady wasn't actually standing on the ground, but rather floating a few inches off the ground. Her face was fairly hard to make out at first, but as they passed her and got within arm's reach, her face became as clear as day. It was pale, expressionless, and looked as if she had been drowned. But the scariest part of all were that her eyes were just empty, black sockets. My grandparents quickly put it into high gear and ran to their house, but not without taking a look back to see where the lady had gone. To their surprise, she had disappeared. Cliché as hell, but what they say happened in the story. The next day they saw their friend and told them what happened, to which he instructed them to never speak of it again. My grandparents have told me this story about 10 or more times, and each time they recounted it, my grandmother would begin to cry, and my grandfather's face would fill with fear. I'm more inclined to believe their story more than anyone else's, simply because of their reaction and the look of pure horror on their faces when they remember this dreadful night. It was June 1987, because it was the baseball season after the Bill Buckner disaster. My girlfriend's parents owned the place. It was in southeast Idaho. It was a pretty big place with lots of acreage. The guy who was the full-time caretaker for the place had just quit, and my girlfriend's dad went out there to find a new caretaker. But the new caretaker couldn't start for 1 month. Her dad offered to pay me $1,200 to go out there. Free food, satellite TV, and all I had to do was keep an eye on the place and feed the dogs and the horse. I had never been out west, so I took him up on it, and it sounded better than doing landscaping. I spent the time reading, exploring, playing the dogs and riding the horse. It was completely uneventful, until that night. After the knocking stopped and dogs stopped barking, I eventually went back to sleep. I didn't freak out that much because there were 2 German Shepherds inside with me, and I had a gun. I kept it on my nightstand. I had been drinking a little but was not drunk by any means. There were several neighbours that were a few miles away. I was kind of thinking that someone had just driven down the wrong driveway. Next morning at the crack of dawn, I opened the front door to let the dogs out and see a white Chevy Nova sitting in the driveway. It was near the small cabin for the caretaker. The cabin was around 100 yards from the main house. I called my girlfriend's dad and asked him if he knew anyone with that make or model of car. He said he didn't, and he called the police directly. Police show up, ask me a few questions, and walk around the property for an hour or so. The car was locked, and the police had it towed. I have no idea if it was broken down or not. There was only 1 set of tire tracks coming into the house. A few days later, my girlfriend's dad called me up to say the guy who owned the car was missing, and to call the police if anything weird happened again. I have no idea who the guy was at all. Don't know how long he was missing or when he was reported missing, or who reported him missing. He was just missing. My girlfriend's dad didn't know much about it either. After about a month, I go back home. The girlfriend and I break up shortly thereafter. I see her out of town a few months later and ask her if she ever found out what happened to the guy. All she knows is that the guy was found dead, apparently killed himself 30 miles away. The suicide happened several months after that incident at the house, and he was found a couple of days after that he'd killed himself. I asked her how he did it, where he was found and who found him, and I got nothing. And I never saw her again. My then boyfriend, now husband, and I were camping at Harriet Lake, which is a very small lake, pretty deep in the Willamette National Forest. We were on a road trip from San Francisco to Vancouver, and decided to spend one of the days exploring Portland for the first time, since our campsite was only around 90 minutes outside of the town. On our way back from the campsite, we approached the last stoplight in the last town, Estacada, Oregon, before the highway narrowed to 1 lane in each direction. At the red light, we were pulled up next to a couple on a motorcycle. They looked to be in their 50s. The man in the front was short and pudgy, whilst the woman in the back was tall and lanky. I joked to my husband that they looked like Boris and Natasha from the Rocky and Bullwinkle show. When the light turned green, they looked over at us, took off, and cut in front of us. They disappeared pretty quickly down the curvy road ahead, and I remember us thinking that we had somehow pissed them off, because they were driving very aggressively. So, soon after, we found ourselves deep in the forest. The winding road was flanked by cliffs on the left and the sparkling, rushing Clackamas River on the right. Several small, old green metal bridges passed over the winding river. Cell signals quickly disappeared, and the sun was setting. There were very few people around, except for a few fishermen, trying to get one last catch before the sun went down for the night. As we approached the last bridge before the turnoff that led to the campground, we noticed that Boris and Natasha were parked sideways in the middle of the bridge. As we got closer to them, we realized that they were staring at us, almost as if they were waiting for us, and I noticed that Natasha was holding something in her hand. Whatever it was producing a fair amount of smoke. I thought maybe we had come across them smoking a cigar or a blunt or something. As we slowed down and prepared to pass them on the bridge, I got a closer look at whatever was in her hand and realized that there was way too much smoke coming from it. Right as we were passing them, she tossed the smoking object under the car, and they scooted off the bridge, then turned around and looked at us as if they were waiting for something to happen. My husband had the quick thinking to swerve and accelerate out the way, and not a moment too soon, the object exploded forcefully right after our car had cleared it. Boris and Natasha, having failed to accomplish whatever their goal was, either to disable our car and rob us, kidnap us, or even kill us, sped off down the road. My husband was understandably furious, and so was I. We were both totally freaked out. I was convinced that they were following us, or had been following us earlier that day, and I was 100% certain that they would return to our campsite in the night, where we were defenseless in our tents, either to finish the job or to get rid of the witnesses. Fortunately for us though, we never saw them again. My cousin is with the Forest Service in Montana/Wyoming, and I decided to go up there with her to literally test the waters. She does hydrology and has to ride out to the middle of nowhere to test streams and snow runoffs to ensure no contaminants. So I thought that sounded fun and wanted to go do a bit of a tour with her. So we were going to have a camp out there for 2 nights. So we packed all our gear into our saddlebags and started out. The first day and night were amazing. Beautiful scenery and amazing air quality. It really is so peaceful out there. I love that area, and I wish I could go up there more often. We started out on the second day, and my cousin said, "Do you want to see something weird?" Of course, I said yes, and she led me to a bit of a side journey into this tiny little ravine. We ended up travelling around 2 hours out of our way from the actual path. At the very end of this fold in the land, she dismounts and tells me to get off my horse. We tie them up in this gorgeous little clearing, and she tells me to follow this tiny wildlife path and bring our little rechargeable radios. It's one of those that you can plug in or wind up. It also acts as a lantern if you really need to, but it kills the batteries very quickly. I do, and out in the middle of nowhere, there is a huge coil of wire sticking out from the ground. The wire itself was not weirdly large, like someone buried a transmission wire, but small, like a 10 to 12 gauge wiring for a house. It trailed off into the bush and trees, so naturally I decided to follow the damn thing out of curiosity. My cousin trails behind me as I do, and this wire, after coming up straight from the ground, is strung across limbs of trees, then back off into the ground, and it snakes around rocks, and finally dead ends into an outlet. The outlet is mounted on the side of a desk. It looks like a schoolteacher's desk from when I was growing up, with a metal base and a pseudo wood/plastic top thing. No chair, no building, no nothing. Just this outlet and a desk. I'm staring confused as hell. Why is there a desk in the middle of a forest? And then my cousin takes the radio, pulls out the cord and plugs it into the outlet. And then it just lit up and started blaring static. The wire was being fed from somewhere. Now, the place where we were had absolutely no road access, and no buildings for many, many miles, with no other people around, and yet there was a live outlet. Weird as shit.
Allegheny National Forest. The missus and I, 2 dogs, and a primitive site about 100 yards away from the road. It was very late in the season, so we were literally the only people for miles. Our campsite was set up with 2 tents facing each other across the fire pit. We slept in one with the dogs, and the other we used for storage. The second night, like an idiot, I decided to leave the sealed food in the storage tent instead of tying it up or taking it to the car for the night. I awoke at 2 a.m. to the sound of ripping and crunching. Jerked completely awake, mind racing, I knew instantly that something was in the storage tent, nomming on some tasty dog food or potato chips. I fumbled for a flashlight and slowly unzipped my tent's fly. Shined the light across the campsite to the other tent. That's when I saw a pair of eyes. I was expecting a raccoon. The problem was that the eyes were about 2 to 3 feet off of the ground. Black bear. Big one. I know intellectually that you're supposed to make noise. I know intellectually that I'm not in much danger. However, being within a few feet of a bear, at night, in the pitch black, not being able to see a thing, but the sounds, the ripping, the heavy tread, the snuffling, it's truly, primally terrifying. Higher thought processes went right out the window. I zipped my tent back up and looked down at my wife. Grabbed my axe and stood over her sleeping body in the tent in a defensive position in case he tried to get into the sleeping tent. I stood like that for half an hour in complete darkness, just listening to the breathing and the hurrfing and the ripping and the eating. A black bear eating potato chips at night is very loud. He wandered around the site, even snuffling at the outside of our tent. I never woke up the wife, because why subject her to this terror, I thought. Eventually, higher thought processes started to leak through. The car was 50 yards away. Maybe I could run to it. Maybe I should make a noise. Maybe it will go away. What was I thinking? The car. My keys were by my sleeping bag, and on those keys, oh, those glorious keys, was the electronic fob. And on that heaven-sent electronic fob was the button we all think is useless and annoying if you accidentally press it. That glorious alarm button. I smashed down that button, and the night lit up with honks and flashing lights. Sound and light crashed through the campsite, and I heard the bear take off. That's when my wife woke up, to see her shaking, pale-faced husband standing over her with an axe. After I calmed her down, we got out and inspected the campsite. The bear had ripped its way into the storage tent and had eaten potato chips, dog food, trail mix. It had wandered around to our side to the dishwashing area, probably attracted to the smell of the dirty dishwater with meat residue in it. Still coming down from my adrenaline rush, the wife and I spent the rest of the night sleeping in the car. The bear never came back, and I learned my lesson regarding food at a campsite. And the whole time, the motherfucking dogs never woke up.
I've told quite a few people this story, and almost no one believes me. But it's definitely true, and is the freakiest thing that has ever happened to me. I had a few years where I was sort of down on my luck. I live in an area with a lot of relatives, so one of my aunts was having a party, and I ended up staying a lot later than I should have. There was free beer, so I had to, and I got a bit intoxicated. And when my cousin who was supposed to be driving me home wanted to leave, I declined because I wanted to keep drinking. So he left, and I was without a ride home. When I finally left, I had an extremely long and uncomfortable walk ahead of me. Whilst you might think that my aunt or someone else could have given me a lift home, my family was a little tired of having to drive me places. So, I prepared for a really long walk down this country road. Although I had been drinking, the atmosphere outside sobered me up pretty quickly. It was really dark and very brisk. And for some strange reason, it was eerily quiet. I mean, usually there are all sorts of animal noises. You know, crickets and frogs and other things. But this night, everything was calm and quiet. I did become aware of some noises in the woods though. You know, as if an animal were walking back there. And the noises didn't go away either, which made me start to think that an animal might be following me. Of course, I was very nervous at this point. I didn't fancy being something's midnight snack, and I tried to hurry up a little bit, and I did get slightly ahead of the noises, so I figured that I'd be okay. However, right then, I heard a sound of several twigs breaking, but the sound stopped there. I had a feeling that whatever had been following me was now directly behind me, but it wasn't moving. I told myself to keep walking, but part of me said I just had to turn around and see. So very slowly, I forced myself to turn around, and when I saw my pursuer, I screamed. There was this large, dark figure standing behind me, and it had to be nearly 8 feet tall. The worst part, though, was that it had red, glowing eyes, and it stood there staring down at me. Well, I took off running right away, and I was so terrified that I didn't even notice if it was following me. I didn't know how far I actually ran, and if it followed me at all. But finally, after an eternity, I ventured a look back and saw nothing. It was still eerily quiet, and I was terrified, but I walked the rest of the way home. Now, I know everyone will just tell me that I was drunk and imagined it, but never before has drinking beer caused me to hallucinate. I know what I saw that night, and I never went for a walk in the middle of nowhere again.
Just a few weeks ago, we're on a road trip from BC to San Diego, and we come off on a campsite just outside of California. We drove through. Now on one side of the campsite it was relatively empty. I noticed a few scattered tents, but nobody close to the location that we ended up picking. We had tons of space. Now we both just wanted an early night, so I started a fire with my girlfriend and started cooking. We ate, had a few beers and climbed up on a rooftop tent with our dog by 9 PM or so. Now I had a pretty hard time falling asleep. I kept on waking up in the night and then falling asleep again. Now in the pitch dark, I suddenly was awoken by the sound of somebody whistling to the sound of When the Saints Come Marching In at around 1 AM. After a few minutes of this repetitive whistling, I nudged my girlfriend and awoken her, who was obviously scared as well. The whistling then turned to the chanting of things like, "When you sleep here you disrespect me, and when you sleep here you're disrespecting the US Marines." The person would then start spelling out words like FLEE. This kept on going and getting more aggressive and even louder in tone, so we decided to make a move. I slowly unzipped the tent while our guard dog was snoring, and I put my head out of the tent. I took a few eyes to let my eyes adjust and figure out where the person was. I felt more confident once I could somewhat see and hear, so I decided to climb down, and the girlfriend passed me the dog and she climbed down too. We flipped the tent up without securing it and we quickly jumped into the truck, while the person was still whistling, and we went to a motel. We just wanted to get away from who or whatever it was making them noises. So the next morning, we drove back to get our belongings. We then saw a family who had been camping over the site, and they said that, apparently, this went on for at least another 3 or 4 hours. It was the scariest thing that their family had ever experienced. The sound seemed to go off into the distance in the woods, and that was the last I ever heard of it.
Over a decade ago, I went to the Amazon jungle, to a family of shamans who had lived on their ancestral ground going back 1,000 years, if not more. All firstborn males in the family followed the path of the ayahuaceros and healers for their community. So I arrive, and since I'm not from the jungle, I am told that we must do a ceremony so the spirits of the jungle would welcome me safely. The ceremony consisted of lots of singing around a fire that was encircled by beautiful flowers and leaves that we had collected and arranged earlier. A cutting of the capi plant was present for this and held a special center location in the biomandala we had created. The people I stayed with viewed the capi plant as representative of Mother Earth, and thus viewed it with reverence. After what felt like hours, the man told me the ceremony was complete and led me to my room located in a separate detached structure on the second floor. There were some windows in the room, and after a short while decided to go to sleep. I was awoken in the middle of the night by a cacophony of sounds. I was hearing various distinct animal sounds. Birds, roars, guttural bellows, screams, sounds that I had never heard before in my life. The thing about it is that the sounds were all so different. They were definitely not all the same species. They all had such vastly different sounds coming from many different locations. I was freaked out, but stayed silent and tried not to move. If I had to estimate, it really felt like over 15 different types of sounds being produced. Then the banging started. It felt like dozens of animals were smashing their bodies into the structure, all around me. There was substantial weight being thrown into the outside walls, whilst the animal cries were going off. I was terrified because the windows were open, but maintained still. I couldn't even move due to the fear of what was just slamming into the walls. So I prayed and prayed for protection, and somehow fell asleep. And I awoke later in the night to a large cockroach crawling on me. The next morning I wake up safe, and no evidence outside of anything having occurred hours ago. I ran into the healer that day, and he asked me how I slept. Not so well, I replied, and explained last night's occurrence. He laughed, and said it was just the jungle welcoming me. I stayed there for around 20 days, and it only happened to me on that first day and never again. I almost have a semi-existential crisis every time I dwell upon this. A few years ago, I was driving across the country and stopped at Prairie Creek Redwoods State Park to camp for the night. I got in around 4 p.m. and, eager to experience the redwoods for the first time, started out on a 7-mile trail run through the park. This was early November, so I knew that I had about an hour and a half until sunset, which I thought was plenty of time for the run. If you've been to the redwoods, you know that the terrain is steep, narrow valleys and, of course, unfathomably giant trees. Twilight came early, and my pace slowed as the light dwindled. Soon as I was walking, just barely able to discern the path. This was the start of a situation, but I knew that I would be warm enough if I kept moving, so I concentrated on staying on the path and absorbing the forest's presence. It was incredibly quiet. I perhaps heard 1 or 2 bird calls the whole time, but not spooky. For lack of a better term, I got a sense of peaceful dignity that existed entirely separate from my human-sized concerns. With maybe 2 or 3 miles left in my walk/run back to the campsite, I rounded a bend and came upon a silvery glowing orb right in the middle of the trail. I held my eyes closed. Was this a trick of my night vision into the fading twilight? But the orb was still there when I opened them. After staring at it for some amount of time, I cautiously stuck my hand into it. I didn't feel anything, though I half expected a sensation of heat, or maybe a tingling, but I distinctly remember how the details of my hand appeared in the silvery light. I traced the outline with my hand, but couldn't bring myself to step through it. Eventually I grew cold, and realized I needed to continue. As I was looking for a way around it, I saw the moon just peeking above the ridge. That's when I realized what it was. I had been playing with a moonbeam that disappeared into the depths of the steep valley. The terrain and rising moon had created a sort of illusion that made it look like a glowing orb was floating in the middle of the trail. It was beautiful, yet explainable. I will always hold on to how I felt rounding the bend and seeing that orb. It wasn't fear, just a keen sense of my surroundings with a sudden openness to experiencing something incredibly beautiful, even if it defied my understanding of the world. I lived out in the boonies, so there were only a handful of houses near me, and I never really saw anyone. Every day when I was around 12, I would walk out in random directions through the forest, just for something to do. One day I walked off the main road, onto a dirt road a few miles away, and at the very end, I found an abandoned house. Not unusual for the area, so I just looked around for a bit, but there was nothing too interesting. Behind the house, I noticed an old trail that went into another forest, so I followed it. I went down around 2 miles, and it brought me to an abandoned summer camp. Now this was interesting. When I looked around the place though, there were little signs that people were still there. Small animal traps set out, piles of clothing, garbage and food. This freaked me out a lot, because I was pretty stupid, so I kept looking around. Not long after, 3 men emerged from one of the buildings. They were dirty, unshaven, and were very, very large. The moment I saw them, I started sprinting away. I left my bag and everything on the ground. I got to a clearing and stopped to catch my breath. I looked behind me to see if I was safe, and I wasn't. They came into the clearing attempting to run after me. I was being followed. I continued sprinting until I got back to the abandoned house, and I couldn't run anymore. So I went into the basement and hid inside a cupboard, crying at this point silently. I heard them talking outside the house and walking around. Fortunately for me, the building was so old, the floors could barely hold me at 90 pounds, let alone those gigantic men, so they couldn't go in, and they knew it. Eventually it all fell silent, but I stayed in there a lot longer just in case. By the time I came outside, the sun was setting, and they were well and truly gone. When I got back home, my parents freaked out, since I was gone for a very, very long time. I just burst into tears and told them the whole story. My father couldn't believe that I went so far away, and told me that a band of hicks are notorious for committing petty crimes in the area, and they lived only a mile away from that camp apparently. After learning everything, I was pretty deterred from going out there for a while. I can't imagine what might have happened if they caught me, and I'm quite sure they weren't just eagerly trying to return my backpack. When I was a teenager, I used to go out camping by myself. I had a spot that I liked that was across a few fences from my grandparents' house out in the middle of nowhere. One of the places I cut through was a pasture full of cattle. Around cattle, especially cattle unfamiliar to me, I tried to be very careful not to spook them, but otherwise cows are pretty easygoing. This was about a mile from my grandparents' house, and probably about 2 away from my destination. The last time I did this, I slipped through the fence to find the cattle already freaked out. They were insanely agitated about something that I wasn't aware of, so I stayed well clear of them as I went through the pasture. I had a good time camping that night and packed up next morning. As I went back to the pasture, however, there was this ridiculously bad smell. It smelled like a skunk had fought with something in a fertilizer barrel full of shit, and the barrel had broken open. It was awful. I tried to look around for the cows to make sure that there weren't going to be any surprises, to not see them at all. They were just gone. There were some bushes and trees, so I thought that maybe they were just out of sight. I keep walking through the place to go home, and the smell is so bad that I set my stuff down at the little fence line and decide to investigate. Well, I found all the cows. All of them were shot and ripped apart. Somebody had carefully shot them in the head with a bolt gun and eviscerated all of them. They had also dug them all into a shallow ravine and piled up the bodies. It was horrible. I hightailed it out of there to get back to my gear, and my stuff was gone. As in, I set it right here on this rock, and it's not within eyeshot. A quick glance showed me that there wasn't anything ripped or fallen out, or something or someone had picked it up when I was 200 yards away for less than 5 minutes. I think Usain Bolt would not have been able to catch me on my way home. I never heard anything else about those cows, but I did not go back camping to that old spot again. So, as a kid I lived about 100 miles away from the nearest town, at a house without electricity or running water, which is the works in the Colorado Rockies. This place was in the absolute middle of nowhere, and we frequently sought all kinds of wild animals, ranging from elk, deer, coyotes and cats. Our property and a bunch of other neighbours' properties bordered national forest roads, so to keep people off our road, we had to gate about 1.5 miles from our house that we drove through before we reached our house. This time of year, we are the only people up there, as all the other homes are hunting cabins, long empty by this time in late winter. Now, this was not the type of gate that you could drive around if you forgot your key. There were tons of trees all around it, with barbed wire, ditches and such, so anyone wanting for off-road around it would basically have to build a new road around this gate. Well, one night, my mother, brother and sister and I pull up to the gate, and we cannot find the key. It's gone. So one of us, i.e. me, has to walk all the way back up to the house in the pitch black to fetch the spare key and make their way back down. Now, it's recently snowed in January, and it is totally dark. You can't even see your hands in front of you dark. And with the new snow, you can't hear anything either. There are a few clouds in the sky, on and off to let some starlight through every once in a while. But it's dark, and of course there isn't a flashlight either. So off I go. First you walk through around 200 meters of trees, then it opens up to a huge meadow, which then narrows back down again to trees for another 200 meters, and then opens up again into another huge meadow, which on the other side of is our house. I set out and everything seems fine. I'm just irritated that I have to do this. I'm about 15 years old at the time and a little angsty teen that is peeved off at the slightest chore. I was not thinking about my surroundings in the slightest, but as I'm walking, I get that feeling that I'm being watched as I'm halfway through the first meadow. That deep, creepy dread that something is right behind you, and you can't see what it is, made it 1,000 times worse by the lack of light and lack of being able to hear. My first instinct was to run, but I knew that if there was something, I was just going to provoke it, so I kept going, and then stopped to try and listen, as I heard a crunch echoing my footsteps. Holy shit. This time I walked a little faster, and I knew there was something behind me. It was probably a cat as well, so I just kept walking right into the second bunch of trees before it opened up into a meadow. I could see our house. I could feel the pressure. At this point we were predator and prey, and I could feel the breath on my shoes. So second clearing comes up and I know what the plan is, and I am about to book it. Thankfully, I'm familiar with what to do, and I scream as loud as I can. As I do so, my dogs hear me and they run to chase whatever it is from behind me. They continue running past me and I book it into the house. When I get in, I grab the 12 gauge first and the keys second, then pick up the tractor keys and jump in. There was no way I was going to walk that again. As I'm driving back towards the gate, I see the dogs running back. At least they weren't hurt. That could have been extremely dangerous. I also see the tracks. I knew it was a cat. It actually started approaching me from the first meadow and was tailing me for a long time. I tell my family the whole story, and I know that I'm not going to get any sleep tonight. From that day, I refused to be out alone at night in the countryside without a weapon. Bonus story. Driving in the backwoods of northern Georgia heading home. The moon was out, but this country-ass road had no streetlights, so basically my headlights are it. I can see silhouettes of things on the side of the road ahead of me. And then this massive shape comes out from behind a tree and begins squirming along the side of the road up ahead. I slow down and ponder if I want to go forward anymore. because while I had no idea what it was, I do know it was large, and looks about as tall as my car, and just as long. I thought I saw spikes on its back and moving weirdly. I decided screw it, and began slowly going forward. I'm in a car. It can handle anything the state of Georgia can throw at me. Getting closer to the thing, I noticed that it's undulating funny. I turn ever so slightly to hit it with my headlights, and it was a deer, trying to hump another deer, and I guess not quite getting there. I didn't stop laughing until I got home, because I was sure for a moment that I was going to be attacked by some ancient unspeakable demon. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's video, please consider dropping a like and leaving a comment, as it would really help me out. Thanks guys. If you want your story read on my channel, you can submit it as a text post to Reddit or send it to me via email. Both links can be found in the description. And if you'd like to do something truly amazing today to help support the channel, you now can, via Patreon. You can find the link in the description as well as the links to my social media pages. But anyway, for now guys, I'm gonna sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.